Hello everyone, in this video we are going to go over some of the basics of CSS. Now there is a lot that goes into CSS, there are a lot of topics, so we are going to cover the most fundamental ones and topics that you will use the most. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it is to be used alongside HTML to style HTML documents. CSS is technically not a programming language, but it is a style language. So here we see some CSS syntax, and we can see that we have this selector followed by an opening curly brace, followed by a property and a value, ended with a curly brace. So this selector will target certain HTML elements within the web page. And then the property will provide a property to that element, and then this value will assign a value to the property we have specified. So we can have multiple property value pairs in here, and they will all be applied to the element specified by the selector as long as the property is relevant to the selector. So for example, if we had an image here, we couldn't specify a color here. We could, but it wouldn't apply itself. Also, the property is separated from the value by a colon, and the value is ended with a semicolon. So this is the general syntax of CSS. So there are multiple kinds of selectors used to target certain HTML elements within an HTML document. So here we can see a paragraph selector, and this will target paragraph elements within the web page and apply a font size of 30 pixels to them. Here we can see an HTML paragraph element that fits into the categories specified here. This up here is also an element selector that targets H1 elements. So here is another example of an element selector that targets table elements and will give them a border color that is black. And here is an HTML table being created that falls under the category specified by this selector. So there are also ID selectors. So we can give IDs to certain HTML elements within an HTML document. In order to do so, we would say something like H2, specifying the kind of element we are creating, followed by an ID attribute, equal sign, and then in quotation marks, the ID that we want to specify. Here, I've given it an ID of ID name, just as an example. And then once we are in CSS, we may want to target that ID, that element, based off of that ID, and we would do so with this pound symbol or hashtag symbol, followed by the name of the ID. And we don't want any spaces here. This needs to be all together right here. So this HTML element, since it has the ID name, and the CSS is targeting elements with the ID name, we will give this element the color red, a margin of 10 pixels, and a width of 20%. So it is good practice to make sure that within our HTML document that ID names are unique across elements. No two elements should share an ID name. If you want to do this, it would work, but it is not good practice. And if you wanted to do this, you might as well use something called a class, which we will talk about later. So there are also class selectors that will target an element based off of the class that it pertains to. So within HTML, if we want to specify a class for an element, we do so in the opening tag of the element, and we say class equals quotation marks, and then the name of the class. Here I've used class name as an example, but this can be whatever you want it to be. And then within CSS, when we want to target an element based off of that class, we would say period followed by the name of the class. And again, this should have no spaces. It should all be together. So we would say period followed by the name of the class, and then we specify the properties that we want to assign to the elements of that class. So if we had this code in an HTML document and we connected it to the CSS, then these two elements, this paragraph element and this H1 heading element, they would both inherit these properties. So we can also combine selectors to narrow down exactly what we are targeting within an HTML document, exactly what we are trying to select. So if we wanted to target an H1 element that was also of the class name, then in CSS we would say H1 period class name, and there should be no spaces here. This should be all together. So we specify the element type followed by a period followed by the class name that pertains to it. So in HTML, if we had an h1 heading element and gave it the class name and connected it to this CSS, then this element would get the color green. So here's another example of combining selectors that sort of builds on the previous example. In this case, if we wanted to target an h2 element that was both a bold class element and a pink class element, then we would say h2 period bold class period pink class. Bold class and pink class are just example names that I've given here. And then in HTML, if we had an element that was an h2 element and it had the class bold class and pink class, then it would inherit the properties specified here with this CSS code. And in HTML, we can give an element more than one class. In order to do so, we would say class equals quotation marks followed by the first class, followed by a space, followed by the second class, and quotation marks. And this is all within the opening tag of this element. So here is another example of combining selectors to target certain elements within an HTML web page. So if we wanted to target an element that was an h3 element or a paragraph element or of the class bold class or had the ID certain ID, we would do something like this within CSS. We would say h3, comma, followed by a space, followed by the p tag for paragraph, followed by a comma, and then a space, and then a period bold class. And this is because we are specifying a class here, so we need this period in front. And then here we say pound symbol or hashtag symbol, certain ID, to specify the ID of the element we would be looking for. So now, if we had an element that had any of these qualities, then it would apply a bold font and a yellow color once we connected the CSS to some HTML. So if we had this HTML here, if we had a paragraph element, that falls under the selector. If we had an h3 element, that falls under the selector. If we had an anchor tag and gave it the class bold class, that also falls under the selector. And if we had an h2 element and gave it the ID certain ID, that also falls under this selector. So all of these elements right here within this HTML document, if connected to the CSS, would be yellow and bold. So here we have another example of combining selectors in order to target certain HTML elements on a document. In this case, we have a selector followed by a space followed by another selector. And this means that we are looking for a descendant of another element. In this particular example, we are looking for an image descendant of an anchor element. So what this means is that if we had an HTML, we have an anchor element, and then within the anchor element, we have an image element encapsulated by the anchor, then this image element is a descendant of the anchor element. So this particular image right here would get a border that is aqua. So another example of a descendant is if you look at our previous HTML document we were working on, we have this body right here. This body is essentially the entire document, but all of these elements here are encapsulated within the body. Everything here that I've highlighted within the body is a descendant of the body. And the body itself is a descendant of this HTML element because it is encapsulated within these two HTML tags here. So here is another example of combining selectors in order to target certain elements. And in this case, we are trying to find an element that is a direct child of another element. So we specify a parent element followed by a space, followed by this greater than symbol, followed by a space, followed by a child element. So you can see we are looking for an image element that is a direct child of a div element. And so far we haven't talked about divs yet, but a div element is very important when it comes to styling certain sections of an HTML web page with CSS. So in order for something to be a direct child of something, it needs to be within the first layer of that element. So we see here we're trying to target image elements that are direct children of a div element. And so within this example we have a div, and then immediately after the opening tag we have this image element here. And since this image element's parent is the div, then this image will be targeted and will have a padding of 20 pixels once these are connected. Here is another image element, but it is first encapsulated within an anchor tag. And so its direct parent is not the div, but it is the anchor. The anchor's direct parent is the div, and the div's direct child is the anchor, but the image here is not a direct child of the div. And here is another example just to show that the ordering doesn't matter, but the layering matters within the div in order to target this element. So this image will be targeted, and this image will be targeted, but this one will not. So now we're going to do some live examples so you can see all of the CSS that we've been talking about and also learn what some of these attributes mean. Alright, so here we are within VS Code, and you can see we have the HTML file pulled up from the previous video. So let's go ahead and open this with Live Server. So we'll click on this, right click here, open with Live Server. And you can see that we have, everything is the same. We still have this plain page here. So now we are going to go over some of these selector methods we talked about, as well as the div element and some helpful attributes to make our page look a little better. So one of the first things we want to do is we want to get rid of all of this inline CSS because we want to use external CSS. So let's go ahead and delete those. So now we have deleted all of the inline CSS elements. This is because we are going to use external CSS, which is where we will link to an external CSS file. We could also, alternatively, do something referred to as internal CSS, which is where we come up to the head element of this HTML document, and we would put in something called a style element, and then in between these style tags is where we would put all of our CSS selectors and modifiers. We are not going to do that in this case. We want to be able to apply this CSS to every file, every HTML file easily. So let's go ahead and create a CSS file. So if we come over here to our File Explorer, and we right click, New File, I will call this example style.css, enter, and now we have our CSS file. Currently there is nothing in it, but let's go ahead and find out how we can link this CSS file to this HTML file. So we want to come up to the head element of our HTML file, and we want to type in a link element, so we say open bracket link, and we are going to type in two attributes here. We are going to have a rel attribute, and in this attribute we want to set this equal to style sheet, and this is because this attribute will specify exactly what this file is that we are linking to. In this case it is a style sheet. We also want an href attribute to be set equal to the relative file path that we are using for our CSS, and in this case this file is in the same folder as this HTML file, so we can go ahead and just say example style.css. And so now this HTML document knows to refer to this CSS file for styling elements. So now let's go ahead and actually style our web page here. We can see that currently it's very boring. One of the first things we can do to make this look a little better is we can give it a new font. So let's go over to Google Fonts. We could also use a built-in font, but Google Fonts has some nice fonts. So if you see here, we are at the Google Fonts page under the Fonts tab, and we can see many different kinds of fonts. I already have a font in mind called Canet, and we will select Canet, and then go to Type Tester, and scroll down and click Select, and then click on this symbol up here to view these selected families. We can see we have these links down here to copy and paste into HTML documents. We are going to use the @import one. We don't want the entire text here because we are not putting this directly into an HTML file, but we are putting it into a CSS file. If we copy this part right here, we will paste this into our CSS file, and we can also see exactly how we will utilize this to apply it to certain elements. So now we have pasted this within our CSS file, and this @import line will actually import the font so we can apply it to other elements. So let's go ahead and apply this font to everything on the web page. In order to do this, we are going to use something referred to as the everything selector, which is just the asterisk. And so we put the asterisk followed by the curly braces, and within these braces we will specify properties that we want to apply to everything within the HTML document. And so we want to change the font of everything, so we will say font family. And we want to use the one that we just downloaded called Canet, and we will specify that it is sans serif. And this is following exactly what the Google Fonts page said to do from this section right here. So now if we save this, we can see that everything on the page now has this font that looks a little nicer than the other font we were using. So now let's introduce the div element. Div elements are useful for dividing the HTML web page so we can apply properties to certain divisions of the web page. So let's put the div tag here, and we will move the closing tag down here, so we will encompass all of these heading elements. Alright, and we'll go ahead and put another div right here. And then we'll put another div right here. Alright, so now we have divided our HTML web page into a couple different divisions. We have this first div, which encompasses these headings, the second div, which encompasses some paragraphs and this unordered list, and then another div for an ordered list as well as a descriptive list. And we've left the table out of all divs. It is not encompassed within a div. So if we save this, we can see that nothing has actually changed yet, and that's because we haven't actually applied any styles to these divs. So in order to target only some of the divs, we need to specify a class name or an ID for these divs. So let's go ahead and give this first div a class of div1, and in order to do this, we put class equals div1 within the opening tag, and then we'll give the second div a class of div2. And let's go ahead and give this last div an ID of certain div. And in order to do this, we simply say ID equals and then the ID name. So now we can actually go ahead and target these divs within the CSS. So if we want to target div1, we do dot div1 followed by these curly braces. And now within this div, we can specify a background color or any property we want. In this case, we'll do a background color, and we'll give it a color of blue. And then maybe we want to target div2, which was a class, and so we do dot div2, and we will give it a background color of green. And then lastly, we only want to target the div with the ID certain div. And in order to target an ID, we use the pound symbol or the hashtag symbol, and we give it the ID name, so certain div. And we can give this one a background color of hot pink. So if we save this, we can see that we now have these divisions of the page, and they each have a corresponding color. Let's go ahead and change this green. So when we wanted to target a div of class div1, we do period followed by the class name. For a class of div2, we did period div2, and then for an ID, we did pound certain div for the ID name. So now maybe we want to apply some properties to all divs on the web page. In order to apply a property to all divs on the web page, we would type div, and then now we can specify properties that we want to apply to every div on the HTML document, not just certain ones. So within this div selector, we will specify a display type. So we will say display flex. And what this does is it sets the display type to flex. And this just makes it a flexible container so we can rearrange some of the elements on the page. Then we want to say flex direction column. And this will make to where the elements are arranged sort of in a vertical fashion. And then we can say align items center. So our elements should be aligned to the center of the page. If we save this, we can see that we now have our elements more centered to the page. This looks a lot better than it did. So if we want to get rid of this white space around the edges of these boxes, we can target the body element and go ahead and give it a margin of 0. So we will say margin 0. And we save that, and we can see that we are now flush to the edges. And the margin property will create space around elements. In this case, we don't want any space around it, so we will say 0. There is also a padding property, which is similar to margin, but in this case, we're just going to use margin. So we set the margin to 0, and we can see this looks a lot nicer. So now we've messed around with divs. Let's go ahead and find a way to target elements within divs. So maybe we want to target paragraphs that are descendants of divs. So in order to do this, we would say div, followed by space, followed by p, to represent paragraphs, followed by curly braces, and then within these curly braces we will specify anything we want to apply to a paragraph element that lies within a div. It does not necessarily need to be a direct child, but in this case our paragraph elements are within the first layer of the div, and so they are direct children. In this case, it doesn't matter because we are targeting descendants. So we will say color white. And so now all paragraph elements that are descendants of divs should have a text color that is white. If we save this, we see we have this white text right here. That is the only paragraph that falls within a div. So now let's go ahead and find a way to target this table down here. So maybe something we want to do with this table is we want to give it a border. So we can say border, and we can say solid black 2 pixels. If we save that, we can see we now have this border around the table. Maybe we also want to round off the edges, and we would do this with border radius. So the border radius will apply rounded off corners to this border, and maybe we want it to be a radius of 3 pixels. You could also use a percentage unit instead of pixels. In this case, we're going to use pixels. You can see it's slightly rounded off. It's not really noticeable. Let's change it to 10. And now we can see that it is much more noticeable. So maybe now we want to actually apply a border to some of the elements within the table. So we could do a TD selector or a TH selector in order to target table data or table headings. In this case, we can be a little more efficient, and we can just do a comma here, followed by a table, followed by space, followed by an asterisk. And so this comma will allow us to use multiple selectors. So this first selector will target just the table. This selector here will target all elements that are descendants of the table. So this asterisk, this everything selector, targets all elements, and this table space asterisk will target all elements that are descendants of the table. So if we save this, we can see now that all of these elements have a border of their own because we have targeted the table as well as elements within the table. So that's all for this video. There's a lot more we could do to this web page to make it look even better, but that would require a much longer tutorial. If you're interested in reading up on more of this, I would recommend going to the W3 Schools website and reading on some of the CSS elements. I will post a link to that in the description. Thanks for watching.